densely-populated.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host, Greg Moffitt. Beginning in August 2020, Freedom from Fear is a free-form discussion series taking the title as its starting point. In this episode, Steve, Taylor and I examine how our relationship with fear has changed over time as the world has become more complex and densely populated. Aside from triggering untold levels of anxiety and hysteria, the 2020 pandemic has served to exacerbate divisions already causing huge problems globally. Devoting so much mental and emotional energy to the situation has undoubtedly made it worse. Fear rarely serves any purpose outside of fleeting moments of real danger, and living in fear is seriously counterproductive. If, however, we can make it through this mass psychosis relatively intact, opportunities for positive personal and collective transformation await. Hi Steve, thanks so much for joining us again today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Hi Greg, it's nice to be with you again.
Steve, today is the third instalment in the new podcast series I've entitled Freedom from Fear. In my spoken introduction, people will have got an idea of where we'll be going with that. Before we get started, however, for listeners who don't know, could you just tell them a little bit about your background and your work in general?
I'm a transpersonal psychologist in my kind of role as an academic. I'm the current chair of the transpersonal psychology section of the British Psychological Society, and I got a post at Leeds Beckett University as a researcher and a lecturer. But mainly, the main thing in my life is writing. I'm an author of 12 books, I think, on psychology and spirituality, all dealing with areas such as higher states of consciousness, spiritual transformation, transcending materialism, and similar issues.
Okay, well, the idea I had for this series literally started as 3 words: freedom from fear. I guess I was reflecting on the situation that we're all living through currently. This has been recorded September 2020, and we're still dealing with the coronavirus crisis worldwide. And again, it's 3 words popped into my head, and I wanted to do something to try and come up with some useful strategies, whether they're practical or abstract. I just wanted to contribute something, basically, because I've never seen so much fear in the world, and I hate seeing people suffer, especially innocent people. And I see so many people suffering now psychologically, suffering mentally, who have not been directly touched by the pandemic as such. I mean, they're not suffering from the illness as such. They may not have anyone in their circle of family and friends who's suffering from it, but nevertheless, there's been tremendous fear and panic and stress and anxiety and even hysteria around all of this, and it's already taken a huge psychological toll.
There does seem to be a strong atmosphere of anxiety around, and obviously it's not something tangible, but it's there, and people are being affected by it without knowing it. I mean, I've noticed it even in myself. I'm normally a very calm person. I live in a sort of fairly stable state of well-being, but I've noticed a sort of bit of anxiety in my thoughts. My mind seems a little bit busier than normal. My sleep isn't quite as good as normal. So I think there is something in the air. It reminded me of when I was younger. I lived in Eastern Germany just after the change from communism to capitalism. And while I was there, I felt this sort of tangible sense of anxiety in the atmosphere. It was very strong. It sort of hit me as soon as I went there, and it affected me. And it's something similar to that. There's a major change in our lives, a major change in our society, and people are struggling to adjust to it. And a lot of us are just picking up on this atmosphere of anxiety.
The collective sort of energy field, Jung's idea of the collective unconscious is very powerful, and I think we all know the expressions about the wisdom of crowds and the madness of crowds, and that works subliminally and at a subconscious level as well. It works in ways that we don't directly perceive, and it is very easy to get caught up in, the emotional energy of a situation, whether it's national or global, or even, as I say, just in a crowd of people. And we've all said at times you walked into a room, there was a bad atmosphere, or whatever it happens to be. So no matter how grounded or sort of stable emotionally or mentally one might feel, as I say, the atmosphere at the moment is so febrile. It's very, very difficult to get away, because you can't completely zone yourself off from it, because chances are that people members of your family and your close personal circle are being very adversely affected by this, and you don't want to in any way sort of belittle what it is they're going through.
Yeah, I mean, I think this notion of subliminal effect through atmospheric conditions, not literally in terms of weather, but I mean just in terms of kind of the emotional atmosphere around human beings, I think it's an area that needs more research. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that highly spiritually developed people have a certain atmosphere around them, a certain aura or radiance, which affects the people they come into contact with. And I noticed this myself when I was with Russell Williams, who we've talked about before, and he had this very powerful aura around him, and people came to see him, not so much to listen to him, but just to feel this kind of radiance he had around him. But I think everybody has a certain degree of radiance around them, and in some cases it's negative. There are some people who we instinctively shy away from because they have this negative aura around them. Other people we are instinctively attracted to because they have a positive aura around them. And I think when you get a large number of people living in a city, for example, I mean, I live in Manchester, which is at least 1 million people, or if you live in London, which is several million people, then it builds up into a stronger kind of collective atmosphere, which affects people, usually, in a stressful, negative way, because there's so much energy radiating from so many thousands of people that, it's a little bit overwhelming, a little bit stressful to deal with. But yeah, I think that's definitely what's happening at the moment. The collective emotional atmosphere is quite toxic. And, it's affecting everybody, whether we know it or not.
Yeah, and I think you could say quite safely that even prior to the pandemic, that the atmosphere was quite febrile, the political atmosphere in many parts of the world for different reasons, but certainly us living in the West, you could identify all the tensions there were around Brexit, in the United Kingdom, the tensions there have been in the European Union, countries leaving or wanting to leave, and the immigration situation. Then we don't have to say much about what's going on in the US. The situation they were in collectively, I think, in their psychology has left them actually particularly poorly adapted to deal with the pandemic, and I think that's why some people are looking on now going, why is the US dealing so badly with this? I mean, the United Kingdom government have hardly been paragons of excellence in this area, but so I think that it's like anything else, isn't it? When adversity hits, your state of mind can say a lot about how well prepared you're going to be to deal with that.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it certainly doesn't help when you have a malignant, narcissistic psychopath, in charge of a country, as in America. But yeah, I think one of the things which has happened is that in American culture, there's a kind of very strong division. I mean, there always was, but it's become more intense now. And also in Britain, you've got this duality between the Brexiteers and the Remainers. That's the kind of division that I've never really been aware of before. And I think that's probably a reaction to the anxiety and the uncertainty. History shows that when there are periods of instability, periods of uncertainty and anxiety, then that's when wars begin. That's when civil wars begin. That's when previously peaceful populations begin to divide and to fall into conflict. And I think that's happening in America. I think it's probably a reaction to the pandemic, that there's this sort of increasing hysterical division between the left and right, between the Conservatives and Republicans. And it seems to be becoming more extreme almost every day.
And as a species, we don't deal very well with uncertainty, with the unknown. And so we will actually put ourselves into, a complete tailspin of stress and anxiety and fear as we try to get back to normal as quickly as possible, as it were, This is why we seek quick and easy answers as well. And certainly I think that in doing that, to many of the systemic problems that our societies have faced, with the environment and the economy and whatnot in recent decades, we've turned to quick fixes, easy answers that have actually made the situation, only kicked the can down the road, so to speak. And I think in many ways the pandemic is a result of that. There's no matter what you think of the origins of it, there seems to be an environmental dimension that has aggravated it, that's made it worse. There seems to be an economic dimension that has left some countries, I say, particularly unprepared for or unable to respond. So we are going through this time of tremendous uncertainty, and people are sort of saying we've never faced a situation like this. And that's true. We've had pandemics in the past, but not the convergence of crises that we're seeing now, capped off by this pandemic. So it is a time of great uncertainty. It's also, like a lot of times of crisis, a time of potential opportunity. So my hope is that our fear in this situation doesn't cloud our vision from seeing what we could possibly take away from this, how we could use this to improve our situation going forward.
I think there are possibly two main reactions to the kind of threats we're facing at the moment, the terrible uncertainty. One is that there's a desire for kind of simplistic stories that make sense, just to make some sense, to bring some certainty into our minds. So I think that's maybe the appeal of conspiracies at the moment, and the kind of simplistic notions of what's good and what's bad. I think, you could say that the human race has always lived with a great deal of uncertainty. In previous centuries, life was very precarious. Death was much more present than it is for us nowadays. Children were in danger of dying continually. A lot of children did die, and so on. So I think people dealt with that kind of uncertainty with religion. Maybe one of the roots of religion is a desire for certainty, a desire for stories that that make sense of a kind of uncertain and unstable world. I think that's happening now with the kind of the strange conspiracy theories that are cropping up to try and make some sense of what's happening. But also the second reaction to uncertainty is division, duality, because the ego feels threatened, it feels fragile, it wants to be strengthened, and the ego always strengthens itself in opposition. It strengthens itself in relation to the other. So we create an other in order to strengthen our own egos. So I think in America, the division between the Conservatives and Republicans, the increasing duality in Britain, that's probably, an egoic reaction to the uncertainty which is happening.
Characterised in the political scene by the neoliberalism in the growing, expanding throughout the second half of the 20th century, I think you and I, of our generation, and I'd say certainly the previous one or two generations before us, have lived in a time of apparently growing certainty, despite hiccups, post-Second World War I'm thinking of. War has continued to occur. There's been regional instability and various problems, but overall it seemed like the direction of travel was up, in material terms and in terms of stability and certainty. And that started to break down really in the early 21st century. My marker, my sort of line in the sand, is actually 9/11. Now, of course, it's a cliche to say that it changed everything, and there was lots of people at the time saying, 9/11 will change everything, but I'm thinking it from the point of view of our collective psychology. Having lived through that, and I don't know how you feel about this, but having lived through that, for me, it was a sort of a change that we never really fully recovered from psychologically. It was a big blow to our notions of a certain world and a stable world. And so I've actually seen many parallels with the reaction from all sides, from politicians, from critics, social commentators, from the masses of populations and all sorts of disciplines that are very similar to reactions to 9/11, in terms of like what caused this and what we can do about it.
I think there's one thing you touched on earlier, which I think is important, and that's the potential for growth. And you could say that we're living through a time of trauma, and 9/11 was an incredibly traumatic event, obviously, and the pandemic we're living through now is traumatic. And in some ways, we live in a time of imminent crisis with climate change and ecological dangers, political instability, and so on. So we seem to be living in a time of great crisis at the moment. But every crisis is an opportunity for growth, and we may also have experienced and be experiencing post-traumatic growth, which is, as I'm sure you know, that's a pretty well-established concept in psychology that shows that trauma in the long run brings positive effects. It makes people more appreciative of their lives and other people. It makes them feel more connected to nature and to other people. And it makes them feel more resilient and more competent in their lives and so on. So trauma is an incredible source of growth. It's actually quite. I do a lot of research on spiritual awakening, and I've hardly ever met anybody who's undergone spiritual awakening in a kind of dramatic and sudden sense. I've hardly ever met anybody who hasn't been through intense trauma preceding that. So intense trauma brings growth. It unlocks our potential, but it also can bring sudden and dramatic spiritual transformation. So I think that's the positive aspects of what we're going through. There's a lot of potential for growth.
Yes, transformation through trauma is a phrase that I've used many times. And there are similarities here between when you mention spiritual awakening and what I've written and spoken about many times, the near-death experience, which I know you're familiar with. So I've likened what happens, or what was happening in general, as I say, with what I call the 3 E's: energy, economy, environment. Prior to this pandemic, I was saying it was like some sort of potentially building to a collective near-death experience, almost perhaps literal near-death. And that's sort of been amplified now. So I think when you're in the midst of a crisis, however, it can be difficult to see from the perspective that you just mentioned. So that's what I'm attempting to do partly with this, is be in the sort of eye of a hurricane and say, let's not collectively lose our minds while we're going through this, because there's always light at the end of the tunnel. It might be a different hue of light than some people would like, but this won't last forever. But when you're slap bang in the midst of, and I've experienced it in my personal life, I'm sure everyone has at least once, when you're in the middle of trauma, stress, a crisis, at times it can be impossible to see a way out, even though intellectually and instinctually that this too shall pass. So, and I think that's where people are right now, even though we've only, quote unquote, been experiencing this since March. Well, certainly in the West anyway. For some people, that feels like an eternity. Because people really feel, I think, quite punch drunk now, because they've never had to go through this amount of upheaval and change for this long.
Yeah, that's true. At the same time, I found in my research that there are certain conditions which bring about growth and transformation. And, because everybody goes through trauma at some point in their lives, but not everybody undergoes post-traumatic growth, and certainly not everybody undergoes spiritual transformation. So there's something that distinguishes the people who undergo growth and transformation from other people who don't. And it depends on this. It's related to things like attitude, the ability to explore your own experiences, your own mental states. And it's a lot to do with acceptance as well. Acceptance seems to be the trigger for transformation, or, the precondition of growth. So, so even though, as you say, when you're in the midst of trauma, it feels, you're almost too close to it to take a wide perspective. But there are some, approaches you can take to mitigate the trauma, and also to unlock the transformational potential within the trauma.
Well, fear has its uses, of course, as I've discussed with previous guests. It's a sort of survival drive, hardwired into us to react to dangerous situations, a spur to react, to do something. If we feel no fear of anything, it's a bit like those rare individuals who feel no pain, no physical pain because of, a strange quirk in their biological makeup. Well, that can be very dangerous if you feel no pain. And that's why I would say, if you felt no fear, because then you wouldn't be able to recognize a situation that threatened your life. But it can very quickly then become paralyzing and have a completely counterproductive effect. So, and I think that's something to watch for. What does psychology, your experience of psychology in general, say about fear? Perhaps in its function and origins.
Well, it's based on instinctive factors. Like, as you say, fear is it warns us about imminent danger. It warns us about phenomena which threaten our survival. Because, most of our mental traits have been formed through evolution, over tens of thousands of years. So most of our fears are thousands of years old, tens of thousands of years old. So, there are a lot of people that have instinctive fears of the darkness, spiders, insects, and certainly, heights. And these are all things which would threaten our survival. So it's right for us to be afraid of them. But with human beings, there's a whole sort of extra psychological, mental level as well. I mean, a lot of these instinctive fears are amplified so much by mental factors, and they become irrational, they become fixed within us. They become overlaid with lots of mental attitudes. And, that's the whole thing about human beings. We have this sort of egoic mind which inflates fear. And I think the ego brings in a whole load of extra fears as well, which are not instinctive. I think there are a lot of things we fear which are not based on survival or well-being. They're created by our minds. Fearing the future, for example, is a purely conceptual fear. And the fear of other people, fear of groups, fear of other ethnic groups or other social groups who we're not familiar with. It's wholly conceptual, So all animals are programmed to instinctively respond to threats to their survival, but human beings have this whole load of extra fear, just for us.
Well, and of course, one thing that's being aggravated in this pandemic situation is fear of other people. Not in that sort of the more abstract. Well, some people wouldn't see it as abstract, but the fear of difference, of the other. Whether it's people of a different nationality, a different race, a different religion, but this apparently concrete threat, literally of contagion from other people, and that's always existed. But that's one of the things that's making this so incredibly divisive. I'm
not sure if it always has existed, actually. Just for an extra point, because a lot of diseases which we're familiar with nowadays are fairly recent in human history, and prehistoric human beings lived in a largely disease-free environment, so they probably didn't have the same fear of contagion. But sorry, carry on.
No, that's a very good point, actually, and you're well placed to make that. I guess maybe then the fears of prehistoric humans. I mean, they had the fears that we discussed, the instinctual fears of, physical threats. I wonder to what extent, and this is something I've always wondered about that we can't really know, is to what extent, because we're told that there's this whole competition versus cooperation debate that goes on in various dimensions, of sociology and psychology and human history. And I've always wondered to what extent when, because we hear so much about the violence of centuries and millennia gone by, and the brutality, but also we see the great achievements in building and cooperation and all the rest of it. So I've often wondered to what extent, say, prehistoric tribe, hunter-gatherer tribe, making its way across the land that encountered another group of humans would respond. Would it instinctivly be greeting? Or would they instantly see them as a threat?
No, not at all. I mean, one thing you got to remember is that in prehistoric times, populations were incredibly small. I read one estimate that said that the population of Europe 15,000 years ago was probably the population of the world 15,000 years ago was probably only 500,000. And there are only 29,000 people in Europe, according to the same estimate. So life wasn't really a competitive struggle. People weren't really competing over resources or territory. So, there was really no reason for people to wage war with one another or to feel threatened by one another because they weren't competing, and evidence suggests that was the case, that evidence has found that there was a lack of territorial behavior in prehistoric hunter-gatherers. And based on the observations of present-day or recent hunter-gatherer tribes who live in the same way as our prehistoric ancestors. And that's really important because there are a lot of hunter-gatherers who don't live in the same way as our prehistoric ancestors. Some hunter-gatherer tribes have been affected by colonialism or their later social development. And some hunter-gatherer tribes are hierarchical and have chiefs and so on. But the hunter-gatherers who live in the same way as our prehistoric ancestors don't tend to be warlike, and they tend to be extremely egalitarian. And when they encounter other tribes, they don't react by feeling threatened. They form cooperative bonds with other tribes. Sometimes they even exchange members. You can swap tribes, and there's a massive fallacy that prehistoric life was incredibly brutal, nasty, brutish, and short. It wasn't at all. That's a giant fallacy. And, in that sense, people were not threatened by one another. They were very hospitable and generally peaceful.
Something you said a few moments ago about fear of the future struck a chord, because that's something, again, that I've spoken about very often. And this is perhaps a dimension in which we, perhaps for many thousand years now, have differed from our ancient ancestors in terms of where we are, not being in the moment, being lost in the past and lost in the future. And forgetting about the past is one thing, but you can populate the future with anything you like. You might base it on the present, but often as not, people populate their futures with, at best, sort of pie in the sky dreams that they don't really do anything to move towards, or, I'll do it tomorrow, that's the future. Or fill it with fears, some of them based, again, on reality, on the present. But I've always thought that was pointless. That you either, if you've got a present that you're not comfortable with, you either accept it or do something about it. And if you can't do anything about it, then accept it. But colouring the future needlessly dark just serves no function whatsoever. And you can, if you're not careful, have the, bringing about self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think something bad's going to happen to you, then is it more likely to? There's certainly some people who think there's an actual concrete dimension to that without knowing the mechanism of how that works. They do. This is where positive thinking comes from. The idea that your state of mind can materially affect your circumstances. And so I think bringing this back to what's going on at the minute and talking about, the risk versus opportunity, I think that, what we move towards, people are talking about the future with great certainty and great inevitability about, what will happen. I think that's still very much up for grabs, individually and collectively.
Yeah, I think one of the things that emerged from the pandemic, one of the possibly positive aspects of it, was that I knew a lot of people who were beginning to live in the present, because nobody really knew how long it was going to last. Nobody knows how long it is going to last, and there were people at home with their kids for weeks on end, like me. My kids were at home they've only just gone back to school, so they were at home for more than 5 months, and we had no idea how long it was going to last. We had no idea what the future would hold. And when on one level, when you're faced with that kind of uncertainty about the future, you have no choice but to be present. Your only strategy really is to take each day as it comes, to live in each moment as it unfolds before you. And when you do that, you do find a kind of surprising well-being in just simply living from moment to moment. And it's the well-being which is always there, but we miss it because we spend so much time focusing on the future and on the past. But I agree with you that, nothing really ever good comes out of the future, comes from contemplating the future. In the same way, there's not much good that comes from contemplating the past. In the same way that you look forward to future events, we may feel nostalgic about past events, but even though it may bring us a slight tinge of pleasure, it's kind of underpinned with sadness as well. Nostalgia is always a little bit sad because those things have passed away. And looking forward to the futures, that has a negative aspect to it too, because it makes us feel a bit dissatisfied with the present. It makes us want to run towards the future away from the present. So even the good things which seem to be associated with the future and the past have a negative underside to them. So really, the only stable and strong well-being that we can experience as human beings is in the present, in just sort of attending to each moment as we live through it, and enjoying our experience in the present moment, wherever we are, and whatever we're doing.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com